Hello everyone, so you're probably having the same problem I haven't. This is a Nintendo Switch and it's not charging because the port has some issue. If you look at it, you can see the pins are all bent up. So if you look in there and you're seeing a port like that, that means that we have to replace the port. So to replace the port, we have to open it up. There's a couple of screws at the very top, the black screws there. And after you remove that, there is a couple screws on the other side at the charging port. There's two there, so you'll remove those. And then there'll be four screws at the very bottom. And they're using a triac kind of screwdriver, but if you order a repair kit, usually online, they come with the little screwdriver because it's kind of like a little special one there. And then I'm just using my finger to go around and pry out the casing. There's little tabs at the top end that you can just kind of pry up, and then you can remove the back there. Then there's this metal bracket that is protecting the electronics inside, and it has these little silver screws, and you can just kind of put the silver screws on the tray after you remove it. Here's the port that we need to remove, and we'll have to take out the circuit board to do this. So there are some ribbon cables that you just flip up the black tab and then pull down, pull them out, and there's several of those. So anything that is connected, basically you want to remove it. I pulled up the battery, and then just going and removing all the screws. So a little trick I found while repairing things is if you take off a part, you can just put the screws in where you took them off. So right here on the left-hand side, for example, there's this speaker. And so after I remove the actual speaker case, I'm taking the screws and I'm putting them back in where I took them. And that just helps me to be able to put things back in the right order as well. And it's probably a good idea to take photos. Just using your cell phone, you can just take a picture. And then if you ever do forget how something goes back together, then you can just have a look at the photos. So I'm just putting the screws there. And then there are some gold and then kind of like greenish screws that are holding on the circuit board on there. I'm removing the heat sink. So there's three little screws on the heat sink, and the heat sink it has this little glue underneath that, some paste that goes onto the CPU, so that will come off as well. So I'll just keep on going and removing all of those screws that basically you see on the left hand side of the battery. You don't need to take apart the right hand side, just the left, because that's where the port is connected. There's a button on the top left hand corner as well, and then you can just keep the screws inside the little button that you take off, and just keep on doing that. There's a couple ribbon cables. There's a little ribbon cable on the left hand side, and this flip it up, and then using a some tweezers you can take that off. And then there's a S. I guess this is where the game slot is, and it has the audio jack is as well there, so we can remove that. And it has a little ribbon cable that goes underneath the heatsink as well. So I'm just using my tweezers and flipping the little black tab up, and then you can slide it off. But this is connected to the audio jack port, so we'll have to remove the screws holding on the audio jack port, and so that we can take off this little module thing as well. So now we have that off. We can remove the little ribbon cable. I believe that this goes to the LCD screen, and so just having those tabs flipped up, we can take them off, and then just using the screwdriver you can remove the other screws. And when you're working with electronics, you don't need to rush. Take your time. Make sure that when you're working with small things that you have a good surface to work on, because the screws can go flying. So you want to make sure that I just doing it on a table, but make sure that you don't have any distractions. Have a quiet place, and make sure that you have time so you don't rush things. So I'm just removing the little squeaker, and then just keep on slowly taking this board apart. So after you have done it the first time, it does go a lot faster. This is the first time for me to remove this Nintendo Switch board. So after that, I've ordered the new charging port. This is the USB-C charging port, and I'm putting low melt solder onto the old part, and then I'm going to be using a hot air gun. You have to use a hot air gun to do this repair because there's these little pins underneath the port. So I put a little tape just to protect the other circuits, and I'm using like 450 degrees Celsius, and then just heating it up really super hot and using my tweezers, and it should be able to just pry it right out. You don't want to like pry it, you just want to lift it up gently and heat it up really hot for a brief while there, and it should just fall out. I guess if you flip it upside down, I've seen where people flip it upside down and then it'll just drop out. Otherwise, you just put your tweezers in and just lift up gently. And then I'm using some flux. So flux is needed as well. It just goes in underneath those pins so that the heat can melt the solder underneath it, because there's some pins underneath the port there. So this heat it up nice, and using some solder. And you can also use your solder sucker to remove some of the old solder. It'll just make it a little easier to remove when you have that. So I'm just lifting up the port, and it should just pop off when the solder has melted. My soldering hot gun is a little bit old, so it took a little bit more time. So here's it after the port's gone, and I'm just reflowing those. I was a little bit worried when I took it off because I noticed some of the little pads came off and one was a little bit bent, but the pads that came off were actually not used. So I believe the two bottom outer pins are ground. So as long as you have a ground and you have VCC or power, then that's all you need. The other pins, some of them are not really used. Some are for transmission. But the most important thing is to be able to get this thing to charge again. So to clean up the old flux, I'm using isopropyl alcohol and just a little brush. So I highly recommend to just clean up using some isopropyl alcohol. And I have resoldered the pads. I've popped in the new charging port, and you just want to make sure you line it up at the very top there. You can see those pads and the pins are all aligned. And then we can apply some flux, and then we can heat it up again and just gently push down on the USB-C port as we heat it up, because there's pins actually underneath. There's actually 2 rows of pins. So here I'm heating it up again. You can just go 400 degrees for a brief while, and just use some tweezers to push down on the port at the very top, and just so that we can get those pins to adhere to the board. I actually do like this charging port because it actually has 2 holes where you can put the screws to fasten it. So it's better than what the other ports I've seen. So I'm just pushing it down at the back so that we can, and then using my tweezers, I'm just testing to see if they move, if it's a good contact, and they are. So that's good. And then we'll have lots of old flux that we used to solder that on, and so I'm going to be applying isopropyl alcohol again, and then just using a little brush. You can go to Walmart and get these little brushes for your teeth, and I think it's like if you have braces or something, and they work really well for cleaning small locations. And so I'm just rotating that there, and you can see how clean the solder is then in the board. So I'm just remove all that. And then the bottom little parts of the port, I'm just going to be applying some flux and some solder just to make it so the port's not going to move when we plug in our charging port. So do all the corners just like that. And then again, you just use isopropyl alcohol to clean up. Now on the board, I did plug it in, it still wasn't charging. So I looked on the board and I did find some dirty chips. So sometimes you have to clean up a little bit more. And I had to test as well because there was actually a shorted IC on this board, which is common. It's the charger IC. So if you replace the port and it still doesn't charge, there's some charging IC that you probably want to check out, because that's very common. Because if you plugged in the wrong port, sometimes those pins short and it shorts out the charger IC inside the machine. So to test out certain components, I just connect one probe to ground, and you just want to check these little guys are capacitors and make sure that they're not shorted out. It doesn't beep on continuity mode on both sides. One side it usually will beep because it's connected to ground, but the other side shouldn't. So on the M92T36 chip, we can test to see here, and I'm testing these capacitors here. On this side it should be ground, which they are, but on this side you shouldn't get a reading. So this first capacitor is good, but this second capacitor I'm getting a short, and so usually that's an indication that this chip here has gone bad. So to fix this out, I have to replace that chip. I went online and I ordered that, and I put some flux around, and then this one again used like 450 degrees Celsius, just heat it up really fast, and it should remove quite nicely. And then you can clean up and retin those pins, so with some low melt solder, and then we can put on our new one. So after I removed it, I also checked the middle capacitor to see if it beeps, and it's not beeping. That means that indeed it was this charger IC that was the problem. It beeps on the right hand side, but on the left hand side it should not beep. And so I know that the short has been removed, so that IC is actually bad. There's other chip on the left hand side, and you can do with the same, just test the capacitors around it. And if you connect one probe to ground and touch one of the sides of the capacitor, you shouldn't have a beep on both sides. So here's my new chip that I've ordered, and I put a liberal amount of flux underneath it, and then you just want to line it up. And sometimes you can preheat the board. There's several different methods on doing this. So just using some tweezers, you want to line up your chip, and there's this little arrow at the top. That means that little dot should be going towards the arrow, because that means that's pin 1 of the IC. So the orientation does matter. And then you just want to put it in the middle, heat it up, and I have flux underneath it as well. And this apply a little bit of force down on the middle as the solder is starting to melt. So just a couple seconds should be good. And then sometimes you have solder blobs that do form. So just with your soldering iron, I had 400 degrees Celsius on the soldering iron to make it nice and hot, so that the solder will easily disconnect to the solder pads, and this go down around each of the 4 sides of the chip, and then clean up, and then we can reassemble and test out to see if it works. So Here I have it reassembled, and I plug in my charger, and there we go. You can see the symbol is going. Before it didn't show that.
It's charging here, and it's working. That's wonderful.
So hopefully this has fixed your problem. If it has, give a thumbs up and subscribe. Also, I am an author as well on Amazon. So if you want to support the channel, you can go to amazon.com or .ca and type in my name. It's Benjamin Newson. And I've just recently published a couple books. My very first novel is called Heart of Stone. It's an interesting story about the end times, and this guy's having dreams, and then his dreams become real in a science fiction novel. I also have other book called Unlocking Your Mind about memory tricks for studying techniques, as I'm a teacher, so several years there. And Over the Great Wall, I've written about my life experiences 7 years abroad in China. So have a good day, and I'll see you in the next repair video.